What's going on? This is Dams It All, the show about the USACE mission and why it's important. On today's show, scientist Chanda Littles is going to help us understand where the dirt goes after we dig it out of America's waterways in our dredging program and how we use that sediment to benefit the environment. But first, I had somebody ask me if they could learn more about the other star of the show, my backyard. So let's go take a look-see. And we're going to start right here with this retaining wall. So my buddy Dan was in town for like a week and I had to work a few days, and so he was bored and he loves to do landscaping. So he's like, is there any landscaping you need done around the house? And I was like, you could build me a retaining wall. Not a bad deal, right? All right, let's see what's next. Next up, we got this swing, which was very popular at all the kids' birthday parties, but only after we removed this huge rock that was like right by their heads, and I think it still works. Woo! Yeah, it still works, and I almost just died shooting that right there. But when we were looking to buy a house after we moved back to our hometown, one of the must-haves that I had on my list was a rural plot. Like, I didn't want anything that you had to take care of. If it didn't live out here by itself, I don't want it. One of the things that I really like about this plot is that there's no fences between my property and both my neighbor's property, which is pretty cool. So it's about 1/3 of an acre total, and we're full of mainly oaks and manzanitas. One of my favorite things about this plot is all these amazing rocks that I own now. Hey, pup. Here are the plastic boats that you see in the back of all my videos. I originally bought inflatable kayaks, but after those pieces of junk popped on our very first trip, I went right to the sporting goods store and bought all 4 of these, slipped them right in the back of the van. They didn't think it was possible. And this is the spot where I jump up on the roof, which Heidi, my wife Heidi, absolutely hates. But I do get to see some cool stuff and take good pictures of like this police helicopter across the valley. At least I think it was a police helicopter. Sorry for the sweat, but it is 105 today here in Northern California. But I appreciate you going on me with this little tour of my backyard. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I know me and my kids and family have loved this little piece of property for a very long time, and I'm just glad I get to use it as part of my show now. Since joining USACE Portland, I've been trying to figure out how their mission differs from my last office in Sacramento. One thing we do here in Portland is dredge America's waterways to keep business moving. That dredge mission is handled by our San Francisco district in NorCal, so when I was working in Sacktown, I never got to hang out with those folks. I'm by no means a dirt expert, and that's why we got Chanda on the line to help me out a little bit. All right, Chanda, I have a few questions for you, and they might seem pretty basic, so go easy on me.
Okay, I can do that.
All right, let's start by telling folks what you do for USACE Portland.
I'm a coastal ecologist. I work in environmental resources branch, and I have a few different roles. The subject matter expert for the Clean Water Act and Coastal Zone Management Act. I do research related to beneficial use of dredge material. I'm involved in estuary ecosystem restoration program for the Columbia River. And then I do general compliance for our coastal projects.
And is this what you always wanted to do?
Yes and no. Yes, coastal ecology has always been an interest of mine. I thought marine biology for a while. I worked with manatees and that was really interesting, but I wanted to do something that allowed me to think about informed decision making and how science can help us to make better decisions since we're actually an integral part of the ecosystem.
Well, I'm sold already.
Yay.
So why did you set up shop in Oregon?
I like the proximity to the ocean and the mountains and the general Northwest climate. I don't mind the rain. I like that in general, as I work with stakeholders or the public or other resource agencies, I think everybody has a underlying sense that we can do better and we should do better for the environment, even within the district. So it's been a really great place to work.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed my time with USACE Portland so far, but I'm trying to get smart on the navigation mission, so maybe you can help me?
Well, as you mentioned, the navigation mission is huge. It's one of the core missions of the Army Corps of Engineers to keep the channels open. And in order to do that, we have to periodically dredge. So big ships need a certain depth in order to come in and out safely. So we regularly dredge the channels to keep them at an authorized depth. And that material that we dredge from the channel has to go somewhere. We also don't want to just keep digging sediments out of the system and dumping them offshore because those sediments are important. It's basically trying to find the balance of keeping the navigation channel open, serving human interest, but also acknowledging that there's an ecosystem, a broader ecosystem that really needs and uses those sediments.
Now, I know we're dealing with the Columbia River primarily when it comes to dredging in USACE Portland, but is this the kind of dredge work that goes on all over the country?
Yep. So on a national level, the goal is to beneficially reuse 70% of the sediments that we dredge. The Columbia River is doing it, but all throughout the nation, districts are trying to figure out ways to reuse sediments. A lot of what we do in the Columbia River is trying to create an ecological lift by renourishing natural systems with the sediments that were dredged from the river.
Now, you mentioned ecological lift. So does that mean that we're using the sediment that we gather to make the environment better, like give it a boost, give it a lift?
We know that it's beneficial to keep sediments in the system. What we are trying to do a better job of is accounting for the benefit or the ecological lift. So how do we make the environment better? What exactly does that mean? Are there indicators that we can measure to demonstrate that lift from placement to 20 years to 50 years down the road? And so now as we're placing material, we're trying to figure out how those benefits accrue. And so how do we create something that's at least as good as and or better than what was there before we replaced material elsewhere in the river?
Yeah, well, that makes sense. So what gets you excited about our dredge mission?
I'm most excited when I'm working with stakeholders that are open to working with the Corps. We have to do the dredging. That's not an optional activity that we do. And so if we could figure out how do we carry out the mission, but also kind of bring along and maximize benefits along the way.
Love it. Two birds with one stone. Now, if I was to explain this mission to my buddies, what would you tell them so that it mattered? Like, why would they care?
There's two kind of reasons I think that people, the general public, would be interested. As I mentioned, in this area, people really care about the environment. So they want to know that the decisions and the money that's being spent by the federal government, we're doing things to improve the environment. And salmon is a huge issue. And so there's a lot of support for habitat restoration, for example, in the lower Columbia River. Everybody thinks that's a good idea. We want to keep salmon populations and we want to hopefully recover them. And so I think people understand that. What we have to do a better job of perhaps is communicating what is the role of sediments and why do we want to keep sediments in the system versus just dumping them offshore. So the dams block a lot of sediments from coming down that would naturally renourish islands and shorelines, et cetera. So if we put material that we dredge from the lower river back strategically in locations where it's either going to dissipate or flow lane sites, et cetera, then we can kind of fill in the gap where the river is managed in such a way that that's not going to happen naturally. The other reason is an economic reason. It's extremely costly to dredge sediments from, let's say, 50 miles up the river and then transport them all the way offshore, because we do have ocean material disposal sites where we can place sediments, and we do in some contexts, but there is a cost for transporting material that far. And then there's the greenhouse gas emissions and other things associated with transporting material back and forth. So there's an efficiency of placing materials in the river, not necessarily directly where we dredge them from, but in places that make sense operationally and economically.
And what would you tell the people who don't like what we're doing with the material that we dredge up?
We can debate on what are the big critical questions that we need to address, or maybe do stakeholders need to be monitoring when they think about these management decisions. And that's fine. And I think it's healthy to have those discussions. But I think we also have to acknowledge that keeping the navigation channels open has to happen. It's not an optional activity. And so working with one another to find common ground is more productive than kind of having these hard lines about we shouldn't do any dredging or we shouldn't reuse any material, because that's just not going to happen. So trying to find common ground with our stakeholders based on just a common understanding that we all want to do what's best, not only for the district and the region, but also for the environment.
Chanda, thank you so much for hanging out with us and giving us the dirt on sediment. I'm sorry. I just can't help it. I mean, I'm a dad. It's like in my DNA somehow. It's weird. Keep it down over there, Freddie.
Hey man, what's happening?
Just trying to shoot a video over here. You're over there living your life in your own backyard? That's my neighbor, Fred. Great guy. Love him. All right, drop any questions that you have for us in the comments below, and I'll run them by Chanda and her team to make sure we get you answers. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of Dams It All. For USace Portland, I'm Luke Burns.